Nora, please look at me. I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life.
Go back, she's waiting for you. I don't belong here. Adam, if you ever loved me, tell me why.
Because I just discovered our marriage was built on a lie. Take one more step, Adam, and you'll regret it forever. Your lies end.
He stands at the altar in a tuxedo tailored to fit him perfectly, and yet in this exact moment, surrounded by 500 guests and the soft, rising swell of a string quartet, Adam Sterling has never felt more like a stranger in his own life. The cathedral doors have just closed behind his bride, her white gown trailing down an aisle lined with candles and flowers worth more than most people's yearly salary. Every eye in that room is fixed on him, waiting for the vows that will make him a married man. Instead, Adam does something nobody in that cathedral, least of all his bride, ever expected. He turns away from the altar entirely and begins walking, calmly, deliberately, straight back down the aisle he was meant to wait at the end of, past 500 stunned faces, past his own father-in-law's tightening jaw, toward the cathedral doors and the street beyond them. The string quartet falters mid-note, the sound stumbling into silence as guests twist in their pews, murmurs rising like a tide nobody can hold back. Victoria stands frozen at the far end of the aisle, bouquet trembling in her hands, her carefully composed expression cracking in real time in front of everyone who came to watch her become a Sterling. Adam does not look back at her. He pushes through the heavy cathedral doors into the gray afternoon light, and there, standing quietly across the street in a worn, weather-faded coat, is a woman most of the wedding guests have never noticed before and never expected to matter. She is not dressed for a wedding. She is not dressed for anything grand at all. And yet Adam Sterling, the city's most eligible billionaire, walks directly toward her instead of back toward his bride. Gasps ripple through the cathedral behind him, guests rising from their seats, whispers turning into open questions nobody dares ask aloud, because nothing about this moment fits the story anyone believed they were attending. Victoria remains rooted exactly where she stands, bouquet lowering slowly to her side, her face caught somewhere between humiliation and something else entirely, something that looks, if you watch closely enough, almost like relief. Harold Bexley, her father, does not move either, though his expression carries none of his daughter's uncertainty, only a cold, calculating stillness that suggests this outcome, however humiliating, is not entirely the surprise it appears to be to everyone else in that room. Somewhere beneath the shock rippling through 500 guests, something else is quietly unraveling, something none of them can yet see. To understand why a man who built one of the country's most respected companies from nothing would walk away from his own wedding in front of everyone who mattered to his public image, we have to go back 6 months, long before the cathedral, long before the woman in the worn coat ever crossed his path, back to a courtship that looked, from the outside, like the perfect union of two powerful families. Because this is not simply a story about a runaway groom. This is a story about a decades-old betrayal quietly waiting to resurface, a bride trapped inside an inheritance she never chose, and a woman living on the street who held, without even realizing it, the one truth capable of unraveling an empire built on someone else's ruin. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 months before that cathedral, before 500 guests ever gathered to witness a wedding that would end before it began, Adam Sterling's life ran with the precision of a machine built to never miss a beat. He woke at 5 every morning in a penthouse that overlooked the entire city he had helped shape, reviewed briefings before most executives finished their coffee, and moved through boardrooms with a calm authority that made grown men twice his age defer to him without hesitation. Sterling Dynamics, the company his father built from a single manufacturing patent into a global engineering powerhouse, ran through Adam's veins the way other men's blood ran through theirs. What Adam did not have, what 35 years of discipline had quietly cost him, was a single unscripted conversation with another human being in longer than he could remember. His younger sister, Lily, 28, and the only person who spoke to Adam without measuring every word first, often teased him about it over the rare dinners they managed to share. "You negotiate with world leaders," she told him one evening, twirling pasta with theatrical exasperation. "But you can't just tell me you had a bad day without turning it into a quarterly report." Adam always laughed it off, though the joke landed closer to true than he liked to admit. Since their father's death 4 years earlier, Adam had absorbed not just the company, but the isolation that came with running it, convinced that loneliness was simply the price of doing the job properly. Lily suspected otherwise. She just hadn't yet found the right moment to say so plainly. It was at a charity gala hosted by the Bexley Foundation that Adam first met Victoria Bexley, an introduction orchestrated with such effortless grace that Adam never once suspected it had been engineered weeks in advance. Harold Bexley, a finance mogul whose empire touched nearly every major industry in the city, greeted Adam warmly that evening, guiding the conversation toward his daughter with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades making things appear to happen naturally when they had, in fact, been planned to the smallest detail. Victoria herself was composed and precise, offering exactly the right blend of warmth and wit expected of a woman raised in rooms like this one, though Adam noticed, without quite understanding why, a flicker of something guarded behind her polished smile whenever her father glanced her way. Lily met Victoria for the first time 3 weeks later, at a dinner Adam arranged specifically so his sister could offer her opinion, though he told himself he wasn't actually seeking one. Victoria was flawless that evening, complimenting Lily's work at the foundation she ran, asking thoughtful questions about causes she claimed to care deeply about. And yet afterward, in the elevator down to the parking garage, Lily said only, "She's good, Adam. Really good. That's what worries me." Adam dismissed it as his sister's usual protectiveness, the same instinct that had kept her wary of nearly every serious relationship he'd attempted since their father's passing. He did not yet understand that Lily was not describing Victoria's charm as a compliment. She was describing it as a warning. That same week, on an unusually cold evening after a board meeting ran late into the night, Adam left Sterling Dynamics headquarters to find a woman huddled beneath the building's overhang, shivering against a wind that cut straight through her thin, worn coat. He did not recognize her, had no reason to, and yet something in her posture, dignified even in visible discomfort, stopped him mid-stride. Without much thought, he removed his own coat and offered it to her, exchanging only a brief nod before continuing toward his car. She thanked him quietly, her voice steadier than her circumstances suggested it should be, and neither of them exchanged names that night. Adam thought little of the moment afterward, unaware that the woman in that doorway was named Nora Hayes, and that her path would cross his again far sooner than either of them expected. The engagement moved with the efficient speed of two families who understood optics better than intimacy. Harold orchestrating press coverage before Adam had even fully processed his own proposal, framing the union publicly as a partnership between two great American legacies. Privately, the relationship remained oddly transactional, conversations between Adam and Victoria often circling business logistics and public appearances rather than anything resembling genuine intimacy. Adam told himself this was simply how people at their level built a life together, practical rather than passionate, though some nights, alone in his penthouse, he found himself thinking not of Victoria's composed elegance, but of the quiet dignity in a stranger's voice thanking him for a coat outside a cold building. He did not yet understand what that lingering thought meant. He would understand it fully, eventually, and far too late to prevent what came next. Adam funded a scholarship that autumn in his father's name, quietly, without press releases or photo opportunities, specifically for first-generation engineering students who reminded him of the young man William Sterling had once been before building an empire from nothing but persistence and a single patent. It was one of the few decisions that autumn that felt entirely his own, untouched by Harold's optics or Victoria's careful public performances. Around the same time, Adam attended a shelter fundraiser out of professional obligation rather than personal interest, expecting another evening of polite small talk. Instead, he found himself in conversation with a woman serving food behind the counter, whose bluntness startled him more than any negotiation he'd conducted in years. "You look like a man who's never been told no in his entire life," she said, watching him hesitate over a simple bowl of soup. He laughed, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. Her name, she told him plainly when he finally asked, was Nora. She did not offer her story, and Adam, recognizing something guarded beneath her directness, did not push for it. Their conversation that evening lasted only 20 minutes, yet it stayed with Adam far longer than entire weekends spent with Victoria's family had. Nora spoke about the shelter's residents not with pity, but with a clear-eyed respect that suggested she understood their circumstances more intimately than casual volunteer work could explain. Adam left that night curious about a woman whose name he barely knew, telling himself it meant nothing beyond simple human interest. He did not yet realize she was the same woman who had accepted his coat weeks earlier outside his own office building. Nor did he understand how deeply her life and his family's history were about to intertwine. It was around this time that Mr. Griffin, the Sterling family's longtime attorney, mentioned something to Adam almost in passing during a routine review of the company's legal holdings, a detail Adam absorbed without much weight at the time. "Your father left specific instructions," Griffin said carefully, adjusting his glasses, "regarding a very particular kind of offer, should it ever come for Sterling Dynamics. I've kept the file sealed as he requested. I only mention it now because your engagement has, understandably, prompted certain reviews of the company's ownership structure." Adam assumed it was standard legal caution, the kind of contingency any careful founder built into his estate, and told Griffin to proceed however his father had intended. He did not ask what kind of offer his father had feared. That question would return to him, with far greater urgency, in the months ahead. Meanwhile, Derek Voss, Adam's childhood best friend and current chief operating officer, had begun avoiding certain phone calls with an unease that only Lily seemed to notice. Derek had known Adam since they were 12 years old, had stood beside him through his father's funeral, had built much of his own career on the trust Adam extended him without hesitation. That trust made it easier for Harold Bexley's associates to identify exactly where Sterling Dynamics' defenses were weakest. Derek's gambling debts, accumulated quietly over several difficult years and hidden even from Adam, had recently been purchased in full by a holding company Derek did not immediately connect to Harold's empire. The message that arrived shortly afterward was polite, almost friendly in tone, requesting nothing more than occasional insight into Sterling Dynamics' internal operations. Derek told himself it was harmless. He would not believe that for very long. The rehearsal dinner arrived on a crisp evening in early spring, hosted at a private estate Harold had rented specifically for the occasion, string lights woven through the garden, and champagne flowing freely among guests who had spent the evening praising the coming union of two powerful families. Adam, stepping away briefly to take a call, overheard a conversation through a partially closed door that stopped him cold, Harold's voice unmistakable, discussing Derek's continued cooperation, with a familiarity that suggested this was not the first such conversation between them. Adam stood frozen in the hallway, piecing together fragments of a betrayal he had not seen coming from the one person he trusted as completely as family. When Derek stepped out moments later and saw Adam's expression, he understood immediately that his carefully guarded secret had finally been discovered. Adam pulled Derek into an empty study, closing the door with a controlled calm that unsettled Derek more than shouting would have. "How long?" Adam asked simply, and Derek's composure collapsed entirely, admitting through halting, guilt-ridden sentences that he had been feeding Sterling Dynamics' internal financials to Harold's people for nearly 8 months, coerced initially through debt, then trapped by fear of exposure once he realized how deep the arrangement had already gone. "I never wanted this," Derek said, voice breaking. "I told myself I'd find a way to stop it before it mattered. I'm sorry, Adam. I am so sorry." Adam said nothing for a long moment, betrayal and old friendship warring visibly across his face, before finally walking out without responding at all, leaving Derek alone in a room suddenly far colder than the spring evening outside. Adam found Victoria near the garden's edge minutes later, expecting comfort, or at minimum shared outrage at her father's manipulation. What he received instead was neither. When he relayed what he'd overheard, Victoria's expression remained carefully composed, a stillness that told Adam, even before she spoke, that this was not news to her. "It doesn't change anything between us," she said quietly, avoiding his eyes. Adam stared at her, disbelief hardening into something colder. "You knew," he said, not as a question. Victoria's silence answered clearly enough. "You're marrying into influence, Adam," she finally said, voice tightening. "Did you think influence stays clean?" Adam felt something inside him go quiet and still, the particular stillness that follows a betrayal too large to respond to with anger alone. "I thought I was marrying you," he said. "Not your father's balance sheet." He walked away without waiting for her response. The weeks following the rehearsal dinner unraveled with a speed that left Adam struggling to keep pace with his own company's exposure. A careful internal review revealed that Harold's influence extended far beyond Derek's compromised loyalty, reaching quietly into 3 of Sterling Dynamics' key suppliers and 2 board members whose outside business interests had been subtly financed by Bexley-controlled entities over the preceding 2 years. The marriage, Adam realized with mounting dread, had never been the beginning of Harold's leverage over his company. It was only ever meant to be the final, symbolic piece securing control Harold had already spent years quietly assembling. Adam tried to move carefully, extracting Sterling Dynamics from these entanglements without triggering a public collapse that would devastate thousands of employees who had nothing to do with the war being waged above their heads. Word of Adam's sudden internal restructuring efforts leaked to the press within days, twisted by anonymous sources close to Harold into a narrative suggesting Adam himself was unstable, suffering cold feet, over his upcoming wedding. A story that painted him as erratic rather than exposing the manipulation actually underway. Lily was the only person who believed him without hesitation, spending long nights beside him reviewing documents, refusing to accept the version of events the newspapers preferred to print. "You're not losing your mind," she told him firmly one exhausted evening. "Somebody's trying very hard to make it look that way. There's a difference, and I need you to remember it." Her certainty steadied him more than she likely realized. One of the only fixed points remaining in a world rapidly filling with people whose loyalty he could no longer take for granted. It was during this fractured, sleepless stretch that Adam found himself, almost without deciding to, walking through the same district where the shelter fundraiser had taken place weeks earlier, asking after a woman he barely knew by name. He found Nora exactly where a volunteer coordinator suggested he might, serving meals with the same quiet dignity he remembered, and this time their conversation went far deeper than polite small talk allowed. She spoke, without self-pity, about losing everything overnight years earlier, about a father whose life's work had been dismantled by a man who could buy silence easier than he could ever earn respect. Adam listened, drawn in by an honesty that felt almost foreign after months surrounded by Harold's careful performances. When Nora finally spoke the name of the man responsible for her family's ruin, Adam went completely still, feeling ice settle where his stomach had been only moments before. "Harold Bexley," Nora said plainly, unaware of the storm those two words had just detonated inside the man sitting across from her. Adam sat in silence for a long moment, the pieces of two separate nightmares suddenly beginning to overlap in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. He did not tell her, that night, exactly who he was engaged to marry. He needed time to understand what he had just learned, time to determine whether the connection was coincidence or something far more deliberate. Nora, noticing his sudden distance, did not press him for explanation, accustomed by now to people withdrawing the moment her past resurfaced. Adam left that evening with far more questions than answers, and an unshakable certainty that his father's old, sealed legal file was no longer a formality he could afford to ignore. Adam requested the sealed file from Griffin the following morning, insisting on reviewing it immediately regardless of the late hour Griffin had originally suggested. What he found inside was a legal safeguard his father had quietly written into Sterling Dynamics governance structure years earlier, a poison pill provision that would trigger automatically the moment company shares transferred, through marriage or otherwise, to any member of the Bexley family by name. Griffin explained, carefully, that William Sterling had drafted this protection specifically, not as a general precaution, but as a direct response to something he had witnessed Harold Bexley do to a former colleague decades earlier. Adam sat frozen, staring at his father's careful, deliberate handwriting, understanding for the first time that William had feared this exact moment long before Adam had ever met Victoria at all. The choice facing Adam now carried weight far beyond ordinary cold feet or private doubt. He could proceed with the wedding as planned, absorbing Harold's influence and hoping to manage it quietly from within the company his father built, avoiding the public humiliation that halting the marriage would inevitably cause Victoria and both families. Or he could invoke his father's protection publicly, in front of 500 guests gathered specifically to witness this union, detonating Harold's carefully constructed plan in the most visible way possible, with no guarantee that Victoria herself wasn't simply another casualty of her father's control rather than an active participant in it. Lily, sensing his paralysis, finally spoke the words Adam had been avoiding admitting to himself. "Dad didn't leave you a way out," she said quietly. "He left you a way to finally see clearly. Use it." Griffin, sensing the moment had come to share the fuller history he had guarded for years, finally explained the deeper roots of William Sterling's protective clause. Decades earlier, William had been genuine friends and early business partners with a talented architect named Samuel Hayes, a partnership Harold Bexley deliberately destroyed once Hayes's growing firm threatened to compete with Harold's expanding empire. William had tried, quietly and desperately, to save his friend's company, only to watch Harold dismantle it completely through a combination of manufactured scandal and financial pressure Hayes never fully understood until it was far too late to fight back. William carried that failure for the rest of his life, and it was in the aftermath of Hayes's ruin that he began quietly drafting the very protection Adam now held in his hands, years before Victoria Bexley ever entered his son's life at all. The realization landed on Adam with staggering force. Samuel Hayes was Nora's father, the woman he had shared a coat with outside his own office building, the woman whose bluntness had startled him into laughter at a shelter fundraiser, the same woman whose family had been destroyed by the very man now engineering Adam's own downfall, had been standing at the intersection of both stories from the very beginning without either of them realizing it. Adam sat with that knowledge for a long time, feeling the shape of the last 6 months rearrange itself entirely around a truth far larger than coincidence. His father had tried, in the only way circumstances allowed him, to protect his son from a threat he recognized decades before Adam ever understood it existed. Now it fell to Adam to finish what his father had started and never lived to complete. Lily, determined to understand Victoria's true role in all of this before the wedding proceeded any further, confronted her privately 2 nights before the ceremony, expecting either denial or cold dismissal. What she received instead was Victoria's composure finally breaking completely, tears replacing the careful performance she had maintained for months. "I was never trying to hurt Adam," Victoria admitted, voice raw in a way Lily had never once witnessed. "I've known for years that my father collects people the way he collects companies. I've spent my whole adult life trying to build something outside his control and failing every single time. Becoming exactly what he wanted felt like the only way to survive him." Lily listened, her anger softening into something more complicated, understanding for the first time that Victoria's coldness had never been cruelty. It had been armor worn by someone who had never been shown another way to survive. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, the cathedral filling steadily with 500 guests unaware of the reckoning quietly assembling around them. Griffin stood ready near the back of the nave with the legal documentation prepared to formally invoke William's protective clause the moment Adam gave the signal. Lily sat near the front, hands clenched tightly in her lap, watching her brother stand at the altar with an expression that betrayed nothing to the guests around her, though she alone understood the enormity of what he was about to do. Victoria walked down the aisle exactly as rehearsed, her composure restored on the surface, though something in her eyes, meeting Adam's briefly, suggested she suspected this ceremony might not end the way 500 guests confidently assumed it would. Adam stood at that altar for a long, suspended moment, feeling the full weight of everything he now understood settle into a single, clarifying decision. He was not turning away from Victoria out of cruelty, nor performing some public spectacle for its own sake. He was choosing, finally, to stop participating in a story written entirely by other people's ambitions, a story that had cost Samuel Hayes' life's work, cost Nora her home and her name, and very nearly cost Adam his father's entire legacy, without his even understanding the danger until it stood directly in front of him. He turned from the altar and began walking back down the aisle, past Victoria's stunned expression, past 500 guests rising in confused alarm, out through the cathedral doors into the gray afternoon light where, by pure and extraordinary coincidence, Nora Hayes stood delivering meals for the shelter just across the street. Inside the cathedral, Griffin moved immediately, presenting the legal documentation to the presiding officiant and Harold's own attorneys, formally and irrevocably severing any Bexley claim to Sterling Dynamics shares before the ceremony could proceed a single step further. The protective clause, activated exactly as William Sterling had designed it decades earlier, triggered an independent audit clause requiring immediate scrutiny of Sterling Dynamics supplier relationships and board interests, unraveling Harold's carefully hidden influence within days rather than years. Derek, given the chance to finally make things right, testified fully and voluntarily about the coercion he had endured, clearing his own conscience through honesty rather than continued silence. Harold's decades of careful manipulation collapsed not through scandal or headlines, but through the quiet, methodical application of a safeguard he never once suspected existed until it was already dismantling everything he had spent years building. Outside, on the street across from the cathedral, Adam reached Nora just as the first guests began spilling through the doors behind him, murmurs rising into confused, astonished conversation. Nora looked at him with open confusion, uncertain why the groom from a wedding she had no connection to was standing in front of her, breathless, still dressed in his tailored tuxedo. "I spent 6 months rehearsing a marriage," Adam said quietly, ignoring the chaos unfolding behind him entirely. "You're the only person who ever just told me the truth." He explained, as clearly as the moment allowed, the connection between her father and his own, the protective clause his father had left behind, and the reckoning now unfolding inside the cathedral because of it. Nora stood in stunned silence, decades of quiet grief finally meeting an answer she had never expected to receive. In the months that followed, Sterling Dynamics emerged from Harold's unraveling influence stronger and more independent than it had been in years. Its supplier relationships restructured under transparent new agreements. Its board refreshed with members whose loyalties belonged entirely to the company rather than outside interests. Derek remained with the company in a smaller role he requested himself, rebuilding trust slowly through consistent honesty rather than expecting immediate forgiveness. Victoria, freed rather than ruined by the very safeguard that ended her wedding, chose to walk away from her father's empire entirely, building a quiet, independent life far removed from the influence that had shaped her since childhood. Harold's empire, stripped of its quietest and most effective leverage, began its own slow collapse under the weight of scrutiny it had spent decades successfully avoiding. Adam funded the full restoration of Samuel Hayes's architecture firm that same year, insisting the project be led entirely by Nora herself rather than treated as charity extended from guilt or obligation. She accepted, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as the work progressed, restoring not just her father's name, but her own place within a profession she had once believed permanently closed to her. Lily remained Adam's closest confidant throughout the transition, the sibling bond between them stronger than it had been even before the wedding that never happened. On a quiet afternoon months later, Adam found himself back on the same street corner where he had once offered a stranger his coat, this time sharing coffee with Nora instead, no cameras following them, no performance required of either one. Worth, Adam had finally learned, was never something you inherited or arranged. It was something you chose, honestly, the moment you finally stopped pretending otherwise.